In 1932, a single sack of flour sold for around 16 cents, and a working family could stretch that into a week of suppers without ever tasting meat. Picture 16 cents. A coin you'd drop in a parking meter today, and back then, it was the spine of a Tuesday dinner table. Number 26 on this list was the meal cooks called a sin, to waste, scraped together from the parts of the pig nobody wanted. And number 3? That was the bowl my own people swore could carry you through the leanest February of your life. The food historians at the Smithsonian and the records kept by the Library of Congress remember these dishes, even when the menus don't. So before the casserole carriers and the cookbooks forgot them, let's count them down. Here's the thing about lean times cooking that the glossy magazines never quite say out loud. It wasn't sad, it was clever, it was tender. Every one of these 50 meals came out of a kitchen where someone refused to let her family go to bed hungry and refused to lose her dignity doing it. We're walking through the Great Depression, the ration book years of World War II, the hard frontier winters before any of it. And one quiet note before we start, because we'll touch food that pushed the edges of what's safe. When these grandmothers reused fat, canned at home, or stretched milk through a long summer, they did it by instinct and necessity. And modern food safety guidance from the USDA would handle some of it differently now. This is history, told warm, not a recipe card. If old kitchen stories like these settle something in you, take a second and subscribe, because this channel keeps the table set for the meals nobody makes anymore. Now, let's begin. Number 50. Cornbread crumbled into cold milk in a tall glass. You poured the milk, you dropped in the golden crumbs, and you ate it with a spoon like cereal that came before cereal had a name. Encyclopedia and food history records note, this was a Depression supper across the rural South and Midwest, eaten when nothing else was left. It cost almost nothing, since cornmeal ran cheap and a cow or a milkman covered the rest. Children remembered it as a treat. Their parents remembered it as the bottom of the barrel. Both were right. Number 49. Fried cornmeal mush, sliced and crisped in a hot skillet. You boiled cornmeal into a thick porridge at night. Let it set in a loaf pan overnight until it sliced clean, then fried the slabs golden the next morning. The hiss when it hit the grease was the sound of a second life for last night's leftovers. Drizzled with molasses or sorghum, it filled a child before a long walk to school. Frugal, humble, and somehow still satisfying. Number 48. A pan of plain biscuits with milk gravy, no meat in sight. Flour, a little fat, milk whisked into a roux until it turned creamy and pale. The biscuits split open steaming, and the gravy poured over them in a slow, glossy ribbon. Cooks called it sawmill gravy in some places, though the traditional bacon grease often got rationed down to a whisper. It was breakfast, dinner, or whatever meal you happened to be skipping that day. Number 47. Potato soup thinned with water and a knob of butter. Just potatoes. An onion if you had one. Milk if you could spare it. Water if you couldn't. It simmered low and gentle on the back burner, fragrant and quiet, while a mother decided how far one pot had to go. Records from Depression-era kitchens suggest potatoes were the great equalizer, cheap, filling, and forgiving. A bowl of this with bread was a whole evening. Number 46. Bread and butter pudding, built from the heel ends nobody wanted. Stale bread torn into a dish, milk and a beaten egg poured over, a dusting of sugar and cinnamon if the cupboard allowed. Into the oven it went until the top crisped and the inside turned custardy and warm. Waste was the enemy. Even dry bread got a soft, sweet resurrection. Grandmothers across the country swore by it, each certain her version was the right one. Number 45. Onion sandwiches, plain white bread, a smear of margarine or mayonnaise, and a thick, raw slice of sweet onion. That's it. Writers who lived through the 30s recalled this with a strange affection. The bite and the snap of it. The way it almost tasted like a real lunch if you closed your eyes. James Beard himself wrote fondly of onion sandwiches later in life, dressing them up. The Hard Times version was barer and braver. Number 44. Boiled cabbage with a ham bone for company. A whole head of cabbage, quartered and dropped into a pot where a ham bone had been hiding, saving every last thread of smoky flavor. It steamed up fragrant and humble, tender leaves going soft and silky. The bone might serve 3 or 4 meals before it surrendered. By most accounts, frugal cooks treated a good bone like a family heirloom, passing it from soup to soup. Number 43. Hot water cornbread, the most stripped-down bread there is. Cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, patted into cakes and fried crisp. No egg, no milk, no leavening. When the commodity boxes ran thin, this was the emergency loaf, and food history accounts describe it as the meal that meant the cupboard had nearly emptied. Crusty outside, soft within, it carried a pot of beans like a faithful old wagon. Number 42. Vinegar pie, dessert conjured from nothing. No apples? No lemons? No problem. A splash of vinegar fooled the tongue into tasting fruit, bound up with sugar, flour, and an egg into a tangy custard that baked into a real pie. Frontier and Depression cooks leaned on it hard. It sounds like a punishment and tasted by most accounts like a small mercy. The kind of thing a grandmother made to see a child smile. Number 41. Milk toast, the gentle nurse of the American kitchen. Toast, buttered, laid in a bowl, with hot milk poured over until it went soft and pillowy. Food writers note it was popularized in New England by the mid-1800s as both an economical breakfast and a soothing food for the sick and for small children. M.F.K. Fisher called it a warm, mild, soothing thing, full of innocent strength. So gentle it gave us the word milk toast for a timid soul. Number 36 is coming, and it fed whole families on a coin, so stay close. Number 40. Beans and rice in a single pot. The most loyal pairing in the lean times kitchen. A handful of dried beans soaked overnight, simmered slow with an onion until they turned creamy, then spooned over rice that stretched the whole thing into something a family could circle. Cheap, filling, and quietly complete in a way cooks understood long before nutrition labels. It carried households through the worst of it, and it still does. Number 39. Fried bologna, the poor man's steak. A thick slice of bologna, the edges scored so it wouldn't dome up, dropped into a hot skillet until it curled and browned and turned faintly crisp at the rim. Slapped on white bread with mustard, it felt like an indulgence on a week of beans. Lunch meat was among the cheaper proteins, and a fried slice gave a working man something hot and savory to fold his hands around. Number 38. Creamed peas on toast. A can or a handful of garden peas, folded into a quick white sauce, then ladled over toast points until the bread went soft at the edges. Pale green, creamy, and faintly sweet. It looked almost fancy, which was the small trick of it, dressing up the humblest ingredients to feel like a real plated supper. Wartime cooks especially loved how it stretched a few peas a long way. Number 37. Egg gravy over biscuits. When the meat was gone but a few eggs remained, cooks beat them into the gravy itself, letting them set into soft golden ribbons in the creamy base. Poured over a split biscuit, it turned a near-empty larder into something that stuck to your ribs through a morning of hard work. Resourceful to the bone. The kind of dish born from staring into a sparse cupboard and refusing to be beaten. Number 36. Hoover stew, the meal named in bitter jest. Macaroni boiled soft, mixed with sliced hot dogs, stewed tomatoes, and canned corn, all simmered together into a thick, humble pot. North Central Pennsylvania historians and Depression archives note, it took its name from President Herbert Hoover, blamed for the shantytown Hoovervilles where it often fed the displaced. Hot dogs were among the cheapest meat going. It was filling, adaptable, and it kept families alive. There's grief in that name, and grit too. Number 35. Water pie, dessert from literally water. Flour, sugar, butter, vanilla, and water poured into a crust, baked until it thickened on its own into a quivering, sweet custard. It shouldn't work. It did. Depression cooks pulled dessert out of the tap when there was nothing else, and the children at that table never knew the difference. That's the quiet genius running under this whole list. Magic worked from the barest of bones. Number 34. Dandelion greens, foraged from the yard. Before dandelions were a weed to spray, they were spring's first free salad. The young leaves picked tender and either dressed raw or wilted in a little hot bacon fat. Frontier and immigrant families especially leaned on wild greens to break the long monotony of winter beans. A note worth saying plainly, foraging carried real risk then and now, and modern guidance would stress knowing exactly what you pick. For them, it was free food and a green taste of survival. Number 33. Liver and onions, the cheap cut nobody fights over. Liver ran far cheaper than steak, and a skilled cook could turn it tender and rich, smothered under a slow drift of sweet, caramelized onions. The smell filled a small house completely. Plenty of children wrinkled their noses. Plenty of parents insisted, because it was protein a family could afford. A frugal, nose-to-tail wisdom we mostly mislaid somewhere along the way. Number 32. Potato pancakes from leftover mash. Yesterday's mashed potatoes, bound with a little flour and egg, patted into cakes and fried until the outsides went crusty and golden and the insides stayed soft. Nothing got thrown out. A side dish became a main, a leftover became a fresh meal, and the snap of that crust made it feel like a reward rather than a repeat. Stay with me, because number 30 hides one of the oldest tricks in the book. Number 31. Navy bean soup, slow and steady. Small white navy beans, simmered for hours with an onion and whatever scrap of pork fat the house could offer, until the broth went silky and the beans nearly dissolved. It's the same soup served in the United States Senate dining room. To this day, a capital tradition for over a century. Cheap, hearty, and patient, it was the workhorse pot of 1,000 hard winters. Number 30. Mock apple pie, the famous illusion. No apples, so cooks used crackers. Ritz crackers, broken into a crust, doused with a syrup of sugar, water, lemon, and cinnamon that fooled the tongue completely. The recipe ran right on the cracker box for decades, and food historians traced the trick back to frontier cooks long before Ritz existed. You'd swear there were apples in it. There were none. Pure kitchen sorcery, born of a cook who wouldn't let scarcity steal dessert from her children. Number 29. Spam, fried and glistening. When the war came and ration books arrived, canned meat became a household lifeline. A slab of Spam, scored and fried until the edges caramelized, gave a family a hot, salty center to a plate of potatoes or rice. The troops ate mountains of it overseas, and it followed them home into the everyday kitchen. Cheap, shelf-stable, and dependable when fresh meat was a luxury you saved your stamps for. Number 28. Goulash, the American kind. Not the Hungarian original, but the budget cousin, elbow macaroni, and a little ground beef simmered in tomato until it all went soft and savory in one big pot. It fed a crowd, it reheated for days, and it asked almost nothing of the wallet. Church suppers and weeknight tables alike leaned on it. Warm, simple, endlessly forgiving of whatever odds and ends you tossed in. Number 27. Chicken and dumplings, stretched thin and proud. One old hen, past her laying days, simmered until the tough meat fell apart. Then dumplings of flour and fat dropped into the bubbling broth to swell and turn pillowy. A single bird fed many mouths this way, the dumplings doing the heavy lifting the meat couldn't. Comfort in a bowl and a masterclass in making a little go a long, long way. Number 26. Scrapple, the meal cooks called a sin to waste. Here it is, the dish from the hook. Panhas, the Pennsylvania Dutch named it, and Wikipedia and Pennsylvania food historians trace it to German colonists near Philadelphia and Chester County in the 17th and 18th centuries. Every scrap of the pig left after butchering, the parts not otherwise sold, simmered down and bound with cornmeal into a loaf, then sliced and fried crisp. Golden outside, soft within. It was the whole philosophy of thrift in a single skillet, the refusal to let anything from a hard-won hog go in the bin. They still celebrate it at the Apple Scrapple Festival in Bridgeville, Delaware, every October. Number 25. Salmon patties from a can. A can of pink salmon, bones and all, mashed with cracker crumbs and an egg, formed into patties and fried until crisp at the edges. Canned salmon was cheap and kept forever, and the soft bones got mashed right in. Friday suppers, Lenten tables, weeknight stretches, all leaned on these. The sizzle, the crunch, the way one can became 4 patties, became a family fed. We're halfway down. The dishes ahead carry more weight and more history. Here is where the story turns. Everything we've counted so far was the everyday arithmetic of hunger, the small clever fixes for a thin Tuesday. But from here forward, these meals carry something heavier in them, the memory of whole communities surviving together, the recipes that crossed oceans in immigrant trunks and crossed generations at kitchen tables. These aren't just frugal, they're the load-bearing walls of how families held on. Keep that in mind for every entry from here down. Number 24. Beans on toast, the wartime mainstay. Cheap baked or stewed beans, warmed and spooned over toast until the bread soaked dark and soft at the center. Plain, hot, and filling, it asked almost nothing and gave back a real meal. Ration-era cooks on both sides of the Atlantic kept this one close. There's a reason it survives in diners still, that humble marriage of beans and bread that simply works. Number 23. Tomato gravy over biscuits. Canned tomatoes simmered into a roux until the sauce turned glossy and tangy, then ladled over hot biscuits. In the rural South, it was breakfast when there was no meat for the pan. And home-canned summer tomatoes meant the garden's bounty carried straight into winter. Bright, comforting, and built entirely from the pantry. The kind of red-stained plate a grandmother could conjure with her eyes closed. Number 22. Red beans and rice. Monday's faithful pot. In Louisiana, Monday was wash day, and a pot of red beans could simmer untended for hours while the laundry got done. A ham bone from Sunday, kidney beans gone creamy, spooned over rice. Frugal by design, built around leftovers and patience. It became so woven into the week that it's still a Monday tradition. In New Orleans, a rhythm of thrift turned into culture. Number 21. Corn chowder, sweet and thrifty. Canned or fresh corn, a potato or two, milk and an onion, simmered into a creamy golden pot that smelled like comfort itself. No clams required, no expensive seafood, just the garden and the dairy doing gentle work together. Cooks loved how it filled a bowl, warm and rich on a cold night for next to nothing. Watch for number 20, where the humblest grain becomes a whole supper. Number 20. Grits with whatever you had. In the South, grits were the canvas. Stone-ground corn simmered into a soft, creamy porridge, then dressed with whatever the day allowed. A pat of fat, an egg, a spoon of tomato. Red-eye gravy if a ham had passed through. Cheap to the bone and endlessly adaptable, grits carried generations through every kind of hard season. The very definition of making something from almost nothing. Number 19. Pancakes for dinner. When the meat money was gone but flour remained, a stack of pancakes became supper, not breakfast. Flour, a little milk, an egg if you had one, poured onto a hot griddle until the edges browned and the centers went tender. Drowned in molasses or sorghum, they filled bellies cheap and fast. Children, of course, thought breakfast for dinner was a celebration. Their mothers knew it was the bottom of the flour bin. Number 18. Souse and head cheese, the bravest thrift of all. The meat from a hog's head, simmered until it fell. From the bone, set into a savory jelly with vinegar and spice, then sliced cold. Pennsylvania Dutch and Southern kitchens alike made it to honor the nose-to-tail rule that nothing from a butchered hog should ever be wasted. Modern food safety guidance would handle the curing and setting more carefully now, but in its day it was prized, tangy, and clever. A whole animal respected, down to the last morsel. Number 17. Stewed tomatoes and bread. Home-canned tomatoes, simmered with a little sugar and butter, then thickened with torn bread until the whole thing went soft and sweet and savory at once. It used up the dry bread and the summer canning in one warm dish. Country cooks served it as a side or a whole meal, depending on how the week was going. Plain, bright, and stitched together from exactly what the pantry held. Number 16. Bubble and squeak, the leftover fry-up. Yesterday's potatoes and cabbage, pressed into a skillet and fried until a crusty brown bottom formed and the kitchen filled with that homey smell. The name came from the hiss and pop it made in the pan. Brought over by English and immigrant families, it turned the sad ends of a Sunday dinner into a fresh, crisp Monday meal. Waste, once again, simply not allowed. Number 15 changed how working men ate lunch. Number 15. The dagwood and the stretched sandwich. When meat was scarce, the sandwich got inventive, layered thin with whatever was around. A slice of cheese, a smear of drippings, a leaf of lettuce, anything to make 2 pieces of bread feel like a meal. Workers carried them in lunch pails to mill and field. The art was in the illusion, in making a near-empty sandwich satisfy a man through an afternoon of labor. Cheap engineering, dressed as lunch. Here's the part that catches in my throat a little. Every meal left on this list came from a kitchen where someone was doing math in her head while she stirred. How far the milk would go, how many days the bone had left, whether the children noticed there was no meat again. These weren't recipes, so much as acts of quiet love performed under pressure, day after day, without applause. That's the truth sitting under every entry from here to number 1. Number 14. Johnny cakes, older than the country itself. Cornmeal, water or milk, salt, fried into flat golden cakes on a hot griddle. The recipe goes back to Native American cornmeal cooking and carried straight through frontier and depression kitchens unchanged. Crisp at the edge, tender in the middle, eaten with molasses or gravy or nothing at all. The bread of the broke and the resourceful for centuries, and proof that the oldest tricks were often the best. Number 13. Depression-era macaroni and cheese. Long before the boxed kind, cooks made it from scratch with a little flour, milk, and whatever cheese could be spared, baked over elbow macaroni until the top went crusty and golden. Pasta was cheap and cheese stretched far. It filled a table warm and creamy on a tight budget, and Kraft's boxed version, arriving in 1937, made it cheaper still. Few dishes say comfort on a dime quite like it. Number 12. Au gratin potatoes, fancy feeling and frugal. Thin sliced potatoes layered with a thin cheese sauce, baked until bubbling and brown on top. It looked like something from a finer table, but it was built from the cheapest root in the cellar and a modest handful of cheese. Cooks loved that it dressed up potatoes into a dish that felt generous, even celebratory, when the budget allowed for nothing of the kind. Number 11. Welsh rarebit, melted cheese over toast. A sauce of melted cheese, sometimes loosened with a splash of beer or milk and a touch of mustard, poured glossy and golden over toast. An old British dish that immigrant and working families carried into American kitchens as an affordable hot supper. No meat, just the rich pull of melted cheese making bread into something that felt like a real meal. Simple, savory, satisfying. Number 10 is where this list starts to ache. Number 10. Beans and ham hocks, the long, slow pot. Dried beans set to soak the night before, then simmered for hours with a cheap, smoky ham hock until the broth went thick and the meat slid from the bone. The hock cost pennies and gave its whole soul to the pot. This was Sunday dinner in countless homes that couldn't dream of a roast, and it filled the house with a smell that meant everything was, for one more day, going to be all right. Number 9. Cornmeal mush as porridge. Before it was fried, it was eaten soft, a bowl of warm cornmeal porridge with a little milk, or molasses, sometimes called hasty pudding in the old days. It was the cheapest hot breakfast in America, simmered up in minutes from a handful of meal. Generations grew up on it, on the gentle steam and the soft golden spoonfuls, on the quiet fact that even an empty house could produce this much warmth. Number 8. Hash from Sunday's scraps, the ends of a roast, if a roast there had been, chopped fine with potatoes and onion and fried in a skillet until a deep brown crust formed across the bottom. Corned beef hash, red flannel hash with beets, plain leftover hash, all of it built on the same iron rule that no good meat dies forgotten in an icebox. The crunch of that crust was the taste of thrift turned delicious. Number 7. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Thin, salty, dried beef, the kind that came pressed in a jar, torn into a creamy white gravy, and poured over toast. HistoryNet traces it through the military, where the 1910 manual for Army cooks listed stewed chipped beef, and soldiers gave it a saltier nickname than I'll repeat here. The dried beef was shelf-stable and cheap. The gravy stretched it for a crowd, and it followed the troops home into the family breakfast. Humble, savory, and remembered with a grin by everyone who ate it. We're into the final stretch now. Let me stop here for a breath, because this is the heart of it. The meals counting down to number 1 weren't side dishes or clever tricks. They were the bedrock, the pots that stood between a family and real hunger, the recipes passed down not on cards, but in the hands, mother to daughter, in the long, quiet hours at the stove. There's a dignity in them that no menu can capture and no budget can buy. That's what's sitting underneath these last entries. Number 6. Cabbage rolls, the immigrant's treasure. Cabbage leaves softened and wrapped around a little rice and a whisper of ground meat, simmered slow in tomato until everything turned tender and rich. Eastern European families carried this recipe across the ocean, and it became a lifeline precisely because it stretched a few ounces of meat into a whole platter. Labor stood in for money. Hours of careful folding turned scarcity into a feast. Love, measured in patience. Number 5. Fried potatoes and onions. The simplest supper there is, and one of the most beloved. Potatoes sliced thin, onions cut sweet, both fried slow in a little fat until the edges went crusty and deep golden, and the kitchen smelled like every grandmother's house at once. It cost almost nothing and fed a family hot and filling. Ask anyone who lived through a lean year what their mother made, and a startling number will name this exact pan. Number 4. Cornbread and beans, the meal that defined hard times. A pot of pinto or navy beans cooked soft, and a skillet of golden cornbread to crumble into the bean liquor. The pot liquor, as the South called it, that humble broth rich with everything the beans gave up. Encyclopedia and Depression Archives note. This pairing was the daily bread of survival across the rural South and Midwest. Beans cheap, cornmeal cheaper, the two together nearly complete. It was Monday, and it was Friday, and it was every day between. and somehow it never quite wore out its welcome. Number 3. Bean soup, the bowl that carried February. Here's the one from the very top, the meal my own people swore could see you through the leanest month of the year. A pot of beans, an onion, a scrap of fat, water, and thyme, simmered until the broth went silky and the whole kitchen smelled of patience. It cost almost nothing, and it never ran out, because you could always add more water and more beans and feed one more mouth at the door. Senate bean soup, navy bean soup, ham bone soup. It goes by 100 names, and every one of them meant the same thing. Nobody leaves this table hungry. That, more than any fancy dish, is the soul of lean times cooking. The refusal, simmering low on the back of the stove, to give up. Number 2. The Sunday pot roast, saved for and stretched. When a family could finally afford it, the cheapest tough cut, a chuck or a shank, went into the pot with potatoes and carrots and onions and braised low for hours until the hard meat surrendered into something tender and rich. It was the week's one extravagance, the meal a mother saved her coins for, and the leftovers became hash and soup and sandwiches for days after. The Sunday roast wasn't just dinner. It was the reward at the end of a long week of beans, the promise that better days were possible. Number 1. The dumpling, in all its humble forms. Flour, fat, water, dropped into whatever was bubbling on the stove, swelling soft and pillowy until a thin broth became a real meal. Chicken and dumplings, dumplings in bean soup, dumplings in stewed tomatoes, slick dumplings, fluffy dumplings, every region and every family with its own sacred version. The dumpling tops this list because it is thrift distilled to its purest form, the act of taking the cheapest possible ingredient, flour and water, and making it stretch a near-empty pot into supper for everyone. It is the meal of refusing to be beaten. It is what a grandmother made when there was almost nothing, and somehow there was enough. That 16-cent sack of flour from 1932, the one we started with. Now you see what a grandmother could do with it. She could turn it into bread, into gravy, into dumplings, into pancakes for dinner, and biscuits for breakfast, and a crust for a pie that had no fruit in it. These weren't just budget meals. They were proof, served hot, that scarcity could not touch a family's dignity if the cook had nerve and the cook had love. What we lost when these dishes faded wasn't really the food. The food was always plain. What we lost was the rhythm of that daily devotion, the woman at the stove doing math and magic at once, refusing to let the hard times win the table. And what they gained, those families, was the deep knowledge that they could survive anything together, one humble pot at a time. So tell me in the comments, which of these did your grandmother make? Which one still smells like her kitchen the second you remember it? And if someone in your life lived through those lean years and stretched every last dollar to feed the people they loved, share this with them so the meals they made never get forgotten.